Hello, welcome to our webinar on CFAIR and AAEA, a collaboration that enhances our value to policymakers, brought to you by CFAIR, that's the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics, and AAEA is the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. My name is Jane Kolodinsky, and I am the CFAIR Program Chair. I'm Professor Emerita at the University of Vermont and currently Director of Research at Arrowleaf Consulting. Next slide. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I'd like to provide some background on today's topic. The Council on Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics, CFAIR, our goal is to translate knowledge generated by the agricultural and applied economics professionals and educational programming directed to policymakers. Today, we've assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work. In the July webinar, we communicate about some of the topics that will be showcased at the AAEA annual meetings in New Orleans on July 28th to the 30th, 2024. The current AAEA president will provide an overview of the expertise of the membership. We will hear about climate change impacts on agriculture from a distinguished fellow, and two AAEA members will discuss highlights of a session on food waste and a workshop on food prices. Next slide. Our first speaker will be Rudy Nega Jr. Rudy is currently professor and head of the Department of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M University. Dr. Nega's research interests include the economics of food valuation, consumption, policy, and health. Next slide. Dr. Bruce McCarl is University Distinguished Professor of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M University. His recent research efforts have largely involved policy analysis as well as the proper application of quantitative methods to such analyses. Next slide. Dr. Carola Gravitas is a Dean's Council Distinguished Professor in the Morrison School of Agribusiness at Arizona State University. She studies food economics and marketing with an emphasis on healthy and sustainable food choices to support evidence-based policymaking. Next slide. Lauren Chenerides is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Colorado State University. Dr. Chenerides' research background is on food economics, studying the nexus between food choice, retailer competition, and public policy. Next slide. Before we start, we wanted to explain how to ask questions during the webinar to make sure that you, the audience, knows how to engage with us. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing the questions into the box in the control display accessed by clicking on the question drop-down, as shown on the slide, and sending it to the organizer. Next slide. Now I'll hand the webinar over to Rudy, who will start us off.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning, everyone. CFAIR asked me to talk about the AAEA meetings and their relevance to CFAIR's mission. So I'm going to provide an overview of the AAEA meetings, which will actually start late next week. Okay. Next slide, Gal, please. Gal, next slide. Okay, so as I've mentioned, our 2024 AAEA annual meeting is going to be next week, starting July 28th until the 30th in New Orleans. And we're expecting about 1,200 to 1,300 attendees in that conference. Next slide. So we're going to have a fantastic set of sessions that will focus a lot on policies, obviously. We'll have 9 pre and post-conference workshops. We have 2 luncheon sessions, 4 plenary sessions, and I'll mention the speakers in a minute. 6 invited paper sessions, 1 invited case study paper, 78 track sessions that we've allocated to the various AAEA sections. AAEA sections are basically like subgroups of our membership focused on specific topics of relevance to public policy. And 15 organized symposia sessions and 75 selected paper presentations and lightning sessions. Next slide, please. We'll also have virtual only sessions. The AAEA board has decided to support 2 additional virtual only sessions per section that will take place either before or after the annual meeting dates. And our business office is assisting the scheduling and promotion of these virtual sessions. Next slide. As I mentioned, we have 4 plenary sessions. The first one is the Gordon Rouser keynote address, which will be on July 28th at 6 p.m. Central. And it will be presented by Aaron Cosette from the University of Colorado. And he will talk about interesting topic related to faculty hiring in the United States and how faculty hiring networks actually shape the production and spread of scientific ideas that can help public policy as well. The presidential address will be given by Tim Beattie of UC Davis, who will talk about putting people at the center of agricultural economics discipline. That's on July 29th at 8:30 a.m. And then the fellows address will be my colleague, Bruce McCarl, Texas A&M University, who will talk about climate change and the economic issues related to agricultural adaptation and mitigation, and that's on July 30th at 8:30 a.m. Central. And then the fourth is the Galbraith Forum speaker, and we've invited Catherine Wolfram from MIT, who will discuss the future of U.S. climate and energy policy, and that will be on July 30th at 11:45 a.m. We have invited sessions as well, and topics are on the slide. Innovations in rural economic activity, new developments in assessing global food security, multiple data sources and methods to inform food policies and market strategies, and incentivizing behavior and compensation to improve conservation outcomes. And the last topic is burning issues in ag trade policy. So very important and interesting invited session topics. We also have other events for those who are interested. We have the undergraduate recruitment fair. We have an employment center. We have committee and journal meetings arranged by the AAEA business meeting. And we have AAEA section business meetings and events as well. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I want to mention that an important event as well during our annual meetings is honoring our class of AAEA fellows. Every year, the association selects a distinguished group of fellows that we will honor during the meetings, and this would include Titus Awokosi from Michigan State University, Oral Capps from Texas A&M, Stephen Deller from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Rachel Goodhue from UC Davis, Tom Marsh from Washington State University, and Alphonse Wersink from University of Guelph. So that's basically it's a summary of what should be expected during the AAEA meetings. And as I've said, I hope many of you can attend and participate during our meetings. Thank you.
Jane, you're muted.
To the Agricultural and Applied Economics meetings. I'd like to remind our audience that if you have questions for any one of the speakers, please put them into the drop-down box. And at the end of the presentations, we will be having a discussion with each or any of the panelists. I think based on what Rudy said, you could understand how not only does AAEA and CFAIR have a relationship with one another, but our relationship with the agencies of USDA and beyond are very important as our research informs policy decisions at the federal level. Next, we will be hearing from Bruce. Welcome, Bruce.
Greetings. I'm giving an address, as Rudy just said, at the AAEA meetings, and I'm going to kind of give an 8-minute preview of that address. In the handouts is a text of the current draft of what the address will be if somebody wants that, but that's 40-some slides, so I'm obviously not going to cover it all here. Basically, our decision space, if we think a little bit about climate change in agriculture, some of it involves figuring out what climate change is doing to us, but we have more active possibilities in adaptation and mitigation. Next slide, please. So here are a number of things that people have said will happen from climate change. I'm not really going to cover any of those except to say, notice yields and productivity are at risk, and so are incomes and regional advantage, technical progress, and a lot of other things. So the question is, given these things could happen to us from climate change, how do we try to reduce their impacts on agriculture? Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about, during the meeting, adaptation, why we adapt, who acts, what we've seen, some potential pitfalls for policy, and what work economists might undertake. Then to a lesser extent, the same sorts of topics on climate change mitigation. And again, I'm not going to cover the impacts material. Next slide, please. Just to have some definitions, when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about actions to lessen the damages or exploit opportunities without changing the climate at all. And under mitigation, we talk about reducing drivers. We've all heard a lot of talk about carbon reductions, and here we're mainly talking about carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions. There's also the possibility that agriculture could increase the reflectivity of the soils that it manages and reflect some of the heat out into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So a degree of climate change is pretty inevitable due to income growth and things like long-lived buildings and population growth. We anticipate that emissions are going to continue for probably 25 years. And along with that, we're going to have an increase in temperatures. And in fact, I think one of the big agricultural challenges is we expect about a 1-degree temperature increase in the next 25 years, which is as much as we've seen in the last 100 years. So if you think climate change is having an effect now, it's going to have an equal amount of effect over the next 25 years. And we need to figure out how to maintain productivity in agriculture in the face of that. Next slide, please. There are a number of things that can be done in terms of management. We can import southern lower elevation cropping patterns. We can invest in research and extension and other things, do more on risk management, and expand trade both within regions in the United States and between countries to exploit altered advantage in different regions. Next slide, please. Just to show you the kind of thing that we're seeing happen, the picture on the left in the top is where corn was planted in 1975. The picture on the right is where it was planted in 2020. Notice there have been movements up into the Dakotas and movements westward into Nebraska, and also movements away from the southeastern coastal plain. Also, if we look at the same data for hay, we'll notice that hay is becoming more prominent in the southern areas and southeast and is getting pushed out a bit up there in the north. Next slide, please. So economists are looking at this and identifying what the economics are of adaptation actions we can undertake, seeing what they have done and what their implications are, and then develop ways of evaluating different proposals for adaptation actions and identify what the costs are of adaptation. In another slide I won't cover now, we see that we're investing about 300 million against a need over 10 billion in terms of what kinds of adaptation may need to be done. So that means we have to pick the sweet spots and not pick just about everything we can do. Next slide, please. So beyond that, other than adapting, which is the way we might act if the climate's warming without trying to alter the rate at which it's warming, we can address this through mitigation. And there, agriculture can be an emission reducer. For example, in the Inflation Recovery Act or Reduction Act, I always get the word wrong, we see a bunch of money to try to incent agriculture to reduce emissions or to increase carbon storage on the land. Agriculture can also produce lower emission replacement goods like biofuels or building materials, and it can manage to have a reflective land surface. Oh, and it can host wind and solar. So next slide, please. In terms of motivating why we might want to do this reduction in emissions, the EPA and a science group estimated what the cost is of releasing 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the air at this point in time. And notice it's about $190 a ton at a 2% discount rate. When we burn coal, we get close to a ton of coal releases about 3 tons of carbon dioxide. And what that basically means is that ton of coal, which costs $100, may be causing as much as $600 worth of damage. Next slide, please. The reason we turned agriculture as an emitter is in a global setting, agriculture is pretty close to the second largest emitter. It depends on whether you talk about things, but generally about 80% of the emissions come from fossil energy use, and agriculture is next behind that. So agriculture is going to be likely a target because we're the second largest emitting group, according to some estimates. Next slide, please. So here's a series of things agriculture can do and how they address those chemical symbols of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And you can see they range from changing the way crops are grown and crop mix, to biofuel production, hosting wind and solar, altering livestock and other things that create non-CO2 gases, and then finally some forest related actions. Towards a policy setting, go ahead, the next slide's fine. Towards a policy setting, we see global drives toward reducing this. We do have a portfolio of things we can do, and a lot of people see ag as a bridge to the future and a low-cost way of getting to a lower emitting future. There are markets in some cases, but largely agriculture is excluded from those. We have recently seen a lot of focus on methane, which will turn toward livestock and rice and fertilization. Well, livestock and rice on methane, because it has a much greater short-term effects, and emissions today continue to rise at record rates. Next slide, please. So finally, what might economists do? Well, again, study the economics of different things we can do, perhaps have some kind of a grading standard of what kinds of mitigation activities might we promote and what are the effects of different kinds, developing a optimum strategy mix, studying how we might invest in mitigation versus adaptation, and looking at the total costs of mitigation, including transactions costs. So that's simply a preview of what I would do. The handout is over there in the handout area. I'm actually going to give this presentation a little bit before the meetings a week from now, and we're going to do a Zoom recording of that. If anybody is interested, they could contact me or maybe contact CFAIR, and we can arrange to have that material available to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for that very informative teaser for the fellows address at AAEA. And I believe you can click on the handouts to get the full presentation. And also CFAIR is going to be happy to post not only this entire webinar in the coming weeks, but also Dr. McCarl's talk. Next, we turn the panel over to Carola. Welcome, Carola.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for inviting me. Today I want to talk about some strategies for reducing food waste, and I will be focusing on imperfect produce next. So 30 to 40% of the food that is available for consumers in the US is wasted every year. And when we waste such a vast amount of food, that has devastating consequences to society and also for the environment. Of all the foods wasted, fruits and vegetables have a higher waste rate. Around 40 to 50% of total production are wasted here. Next slide. And one of the reasons for that is that the aesthetic standards are really important when it comes to the amount of fruits and vegetables wasted. Retailers have very strict standards when it comes to the cosmetics of produce, so that causes much of the waste. And there are some companies like Misfits Market or Hungry Harvest and Too Good To Go, and they already offer some solutions for increasing sustainability and making use of imperfect produce, but they are only partial solutions. So the research team that I am working with, we are looking at the question, what are barriers and opportunities for imperfect produce along the fresh produce value chain? Next. So here, just a shout out to the team. You can see we are quite a large group from different universities, also one colleague in the UK, and we are very grateful to USDA NIFA for sponsoring our project. Next. In our project, we have 3 prongs of research that we are tackling. We have qualitative in-depth interviews with value chain actors. Then we have quantitative industry interviews, industry surveys, and quantitative consumer surveys. And today I'm focusing on the in-depth interviews and the consumer surveys. Next. So in our in-depth interviews, we conducted semi-structured interviews with stakeholders in 2023. So far, we have interviewed 14 stakeholders, such as growers, processors, distributors, and retailers, and we hope that we probably get up to 20 next. And to just give you an insight of what they are saying, here are some quotes from the interviews. One grower said, "If we see that the quality of produce is too low, it will likely remain unharvested." And another one said, "Retailers are scared to offer fruits and vegetables with cosmetic flaws. They think it will cannibalize the sales of regular produce they have in stores. So this is one of the things that we then focus on in our consumer research to see, is there really a cannibalization effect between perfect and imperfect produce? Next. So in our retailer-focused consumer survey, we conducted online choice experiments using Qualtrics, and we survey US produce consumers nationally. And we just recently concluded this study. Here we focus on discrete choice experiments and open-ended choice experiments. Next slide, please. On the left-hand side, you can see one example of a choice set from the discrete choice experiment. In the discrete choice experiment, we offer two options of perfect and imperfect apples. On the left are the imperfect apples, and on the right, the perfect apples. And then the participants choose between these two options, and they can also, if they don't prefer to buy any of them, they can choose the none of these. And then we add the open-ended choice experiment, because here we also get the quantity. So we not only ask which of these two different types of apples do you prefer, but also to enter the quantity that one would like to buy. Next. And here are some preliminary results of willingness to pay. On the left, we see the results from the discrete choice experiment. And here we see that the willingness to pay for imperfect apples is more than 50% lower than the willingness to pay for perfect apples, only 92 cents per pound compared to 2.34 for perfect apples. But when we then look at the willingness to pay estimates from the open-ended choice experiment, we see that here the willingness to pay is quite close together, 96 cents per unit for imperfect apples compared to $1 for perfect apples. So in our next analyses, we will look at what could be reasons for these differences. And then when we take the data from the open-ended choice experiment, we also can derive the demand curves, and we can see that indeed, based on our data, perfect and imperfect apples are substitutes. That means based on our study, the imperfect produce cannibalizes the sales of fresh produce or perfect produce. So our next question is then, could it be because we look at both perfect, fresh apples and, I'm sorry, could you go back one slide? So in our next study, we want to look, is it because we are just comparing fresh perfect apples and fresh imperfect apples, or what could be the effect of processed produce? Next. So here we did an online study again via Qualtrics, and we surveyed 1,203 produce consumers nationally in 2023. Here we used a labeled discrete choice experiment, and we focus on fresh and produce, processed tomatoes. We not only tested an ugly produce label here, we also included organic to compare, is ugly conventional different from ugly organic products. Next. In addition, we also look at the effect of information. Here, half of the participants were assigned to an information treatment. They received information on consuming imperfect produce, and that reduces overall food waste and also benefits the environment and farmers. Next. Here are the preliminary results for willingness to pay from this study. On the left side, you see the results for no information. On the right side, you see the results for information. And the first thing we note is that willingness to pay is highest for perfect organic, whether it's fresh or processed, followed by perfect non-organic. Again, the imperfect products have a lower willingness to pay in this discrete choice experiment, just how we found it for apples. We do see that imperfect non-organic has the lowest willingness to pay. But when we now look at the processed versus fresh, we can see that willingness to pay for imperfect processed products is higher compared to the fresh imperfect product. Information in our study so far does not have a big impact. So in our further analyses, we will look more into, is there a difference between the different information that we gave? How much is to explain there? Next slide. And if you would like to learn more, we are having a session on Monday, July 29th at the meetings in New Orleans. Our session is from 10 to 11:30. We have 8 different presentations. Several other colleagues are presenting here, for example, on the actionability of household food waste, on California's mandatory food scrap segregation and recycling bill. We will also hear about assessing food waste in developing countries, and we will hear about food waste attitudes and behaviors among people living alone. Next slide. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carola, for that very interesting and informative presentation. I'm sure the audience will have lots of questions for you. So audience, please don't forget to type your questions in the drop-down box. Our last presenter is Lauren Chenerides. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you, Jane. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State, and today I am here to share information about a 2-day post-conference workshop sponsored by the Economic Research Service on food prices and forecasting. And the purpose of this workshop is to bring together economists in an organized forum to discuss recent research on food prices and methodological advancements in food price forecasting. Next slide, please. I'll begin by showing you a slide that features a graph that was produced by the ERS. And this graph details the percent change in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, from 2014 to 2024. It tracks changes in food prices represented in orange for food away from home and food at home in blue. And it compares those price changes to overall inflation in the dotted line. So the main takeaways from showing you this graph here is that from 2014, food away from home prices consistently rise above overall CPI, which implies that dining out has become increasingly more expensive. Grocery prices, which represented by the blue line, stayed closer to the overall CPI until about 2021, but then we see that those prices also began to rise very steeply. And this divergence between food prices, whether food at home or food away from home, and CPI can imply several things, both macro and micro. And it's been a priority of the Economic Research Service to analyze the drivers of these trends. They produce one of the most highly used data sets, the Food Price Outlook, and that's a price forecast series which is used by government agencies, industry professionals, and academics for policy planning and economic analysis. Next slide, please. A few years ago, probably a couple years ago now, the ERS brought together a team of researchers, one of them being myself, from various universities, and they sponsored research projects focusing on understanding these market price dynamics. Some of the topics include examining the impacts of supply chain disruptions on food markets downstream to economic drivers behind food price inflation. Some of the research featured here has already been published, and it highlights the ERS's collaborations with academic institutions to integrate broader economic data, especially data that's produced by ERS, and study market dynamics affecting food prices. Next slide, please. The economic impact of rising food prices, of course, we can all agree is far-reaching, and creating reliable food price forecasts are important to inform policy decisions and ensure food security. Improved forecasting methods contribute to maintaining stabilized markets and reducing uncertainty. So as one of the recipients of the subaward on this larger strategic grant, I'm helping organize this workshop with Matt McLaughlin, who was formerly at ERS and now he's at Cornell, and Megan Schweitzer at ERS currently, that addresses expanding the expanding scope and complexity of food price research. Next slide, please. The workshop is meant to bring together a diverse audience from agricultural and applied economists to government officials and industry leaders. The speakers and attendees that we have already signed up focus on a range of topics related to policymaking, food security, economic planning, or just simply interested in the topic and want to learn how they can expand the research frontier. So we've really done a job to look at various aspects, especially depending on which point you're at in this research, contributing to this research agenda. Next slide, please. Here are some of the folks who will be presenting at the workshop. We have about 30 presenters, and they include anyone from people working at ERS specifically. We've got representatives from the Fed, from different data organizations, public, private, and of course, folks from across different academic institutions. Next slide, please. The key thing I wanted to highlight in this presentation is the partnership between AAEA and ERS. Because of our collaboration with AAEA, we've been able to create this workshop that really has far-reaching impact and extends out to a bunch of people who can actually learn about and are informed about the fact that this workshop is being put together. Really bridging that gap between academic research and practical applications. The partnership also enriches the workshop by providing a platform for sharing these ideas and fostering discussions that are particularly relevant given our current economic climate. Lastly, we are going to be proposing a call for papers for a special issue. Details are still in progress, but this will be an exciting journal issue that we would hope to bring together 6 to 8 papers. Ideally, the papers will be from participants at our workshop and then members of the Strategic Priority Grant, but we're going to open the call up to anybody. Next slide, please. Here are some details about, again, just the event itself. The QR code, if you want to scan it, directs you right to the link for signing up and registering for the workshop. It's, the thing I'll say about the workshop is it's much more intimate than the actual conference itself. Rudy mentioned there's over 1,200 attendees at the main conference, and to have this particular workshop with about 75 to 80 attendees is really meant to encourage those networking opportunities and facilitate conversations among attendees. And even if you don't plan to attend this post-conference workshop, AAEA organizes many pre and post-conference workshops every year. So if you have an idea, AAEA has calls for proposals annually, and we follow the same process of putting together a proposal to put this workshop together. Next slide, please. And I also want to give a hat tip to everybody else who's putting together these workshops. Here are a list of pre-conference workshops which take place on July 27th. As you're aware, the official conference is the 28th to the 30th. So Saturday is the day for the pre-conference workshop. And then next slide, there are post-conference workshops as well. Actually, just 2 this year, and ours is a 2-day. Typically, they're just about a day. So here are those for you as well. If you scan that QR code, you will be taken to the site, so you'll see all those details. Next slide. That's all I have for you. If you have any questions or are interested in how to put together workshop proposals or interested in attending, there's still time to register, but that's my contact info. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lauren. A quick word of thanks to our partners. This and other CFAIR programming wouldn't be possible without the continuing support of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. That's who we highlighted today, down there on the bottom right of your screen, AAEA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistics Service, NASS, for which the 2024 or 2022 Census of Agriculture just was released, and we recently had a webinar that highlighted that, as well as the USDA's Economic Research Service, ERS, which was mentioned by Lauren. Finally, next slide. We'd like to give a big thanks to you, our panelists. We want to also thank our audience. We're passionate about the subjects that we present, and we think you are too. But it's not a small thing to give up an hour of your time to spend it with us. We hope you've enjoyed this event as much as we've enjoyed hosting it. Thanks so much. Have a great day and see you next month. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.